You're listening to AltElxn 2025, a national election broadcast series produced by stations across the country exploring underrepresented voices, emerging issues, and alternative perspectives in the lead up to Canada's federal election on April 28th. The initiative is supported by the Covering Canada Elections 2025 Fund in partnership with the Public Policy Forum, Rideau Hall Foundation, and the Michener Awards Foundation. Learn more at AltElxn.ca. And now, today's episode.
Our young people are saying, I want to start a business. I want to invent something. I want to become a tradesman. And then when I get good enough at that, I want to hire 5 other tradesmen. By the time I retire, I want to have 300 employees. And then I want to give that company to my kids. These are the stories that I hear when I go out and about in Canada. And the great news is we can have all those things. That's the optimistic message that I have for people.
That is the sound of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre speaking on the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. A lot of politicians have taken to podcasts and TikTok trends to get their campaigns out there. Last year in the US, we saw how social media could be used to generate awareness, even if it includes pure nonsense.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, they're eating the pets of the people that live there.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
Y'all know how I'm a registered voter? That's very cutesy, very demure.
But a lot of voters are having their political conversations online, and party leaders are aware of this as they head into their election campaigns. Well, a new report from the University of Ottawa is looking into the roles that influencers play during elections. The report is co-authored by Dr. Elizabeth Dubois and Louise Stahl. I had the chance to speak with Dr. Dubois about her report over a Zoom call this week. Here's that conversation. Just to start us off, it's a bit of an easy one, but I was wondering if you could define what an influencer even is for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, easy one, you would think, because I've written a whole report about it and it's my research area of focus. But in reality, defining influencer is actually a little tricky. So a simple definition is online content creators who have amassed a following. Typically, they have some sort of persona or personal brand. But then beyond that, it gets a lot trickier. People have competing definitions. The type of influencer sometimes impacts how we define it. I'm thinking about like audience size as being a major contributor. So sometimes you think influencers need to have huge followings, but then other times you think about an influencer that has maybe 2,000 followers, but is super influential within a specific niche community. I would say they count. So yeah, that's the quick one, but it isn't actually all that simple, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's kind of subjective. I'm also curious to know, before we get into like the meat of the report that we're going to be talking about today, what drew you to study this topic in the first place? Like, was there any kind of moments or like campaign issues that made you think something big is happening here?
So I've been really interested in how political parties make use of social media and other digital technology for over a decade at this point. And what was interesting to me is I was seeing changes in the strategies being used. There was a lot more recognition of the information ecosystem that actually exists and the way that information flows across different platforms. I think the fact that it's really hard to actually go viral online proves that you need people who are experts in understanding that online environment. And that's what influencers are. So I saw that happening. I also saw in elections all around the world, campaigns experimenting with working with influencers in different ways. And I thought, you know what? It's probably going to happen in Canada. Let's try and understand it better in the Canadian context so that we can be prepared.
Yeah, and here we are, and now you've got an understanding of how it looks in the Canadian context. I was wondering if you could kind of expand on what political influencing would look like. If I'm scrolling on my feed today, what would that look like?
Yeah, so it can look a bunch of different ways. So the way that's kind of most commonly talked about is influencer advertising. And this you'd be used to from all kinds of different domains. You see these influencers show up in your feed. They maybe have like a sponsored by hashtag or partnership kind of hashtag in the comments or caption. Sometimes they say it explicitly. Depends on the influencer, depends on the platform. That can happen in politics too. In the Canadian election, we haven't been seeing a ton of that. We've also seen more frequently kind of collaborative approaches with political parties. So, leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh, he and his team have said, hey, want to join us on the tour bus for a day? Join us. We'll give you a seat. You can follow us along. We'll do some content creation together. You can get a sense of this.
If you are a content creator, check this out. We have reserved a spot for you.
And so that is being framed really as like volunteerism, but it also kind of looks a lot like how we expect journalists to show up on a campaign trail and the kind of access that journalists would receive. So it kind of blurs some boundaries. We also have influencers who pitch themselves as journalists. Some of them are trained journalists, some of them are not trained journalists. And what we see is they kind of report on the day-to-day news from the campaign trail. Some of them are actually literally following the campaign buses. This is super common in the Conservative Party leadership case, for example. And others are at home watching what's happening, collecting information, and then summarizing it and repurposing it and framing it in different ways for their audiences. Yeah. Then there's a whole bunch of like potentially really problematic, nefarious uses, which we can get into if you want.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to ask about the downsides to that, because it makes it accessible for a lot of younger audiences. So there are definitely perks, which you expand on in your report. But if we can talk about the downside, and specifically about the demographics that are susceptible to receiving misinformation, like I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of demographics susceptible to receiving mis and disinformation, it's across the board. It isn't just one demographic that is kind of at risk of being targeted. Definitely, we know that media literacy varies by age. We know that media literacy in a kind of traditional sense, where it's think about who the editor is, think about who owns the newspaper, those kinds of things, which are still really important, are usually fairly strong among older generations and not as strong necessarily among younger generations. But then there's the flip side of actually understanding how these platforms work. Younger generations tend to be a lot more digitally literate, which then kind of overlaps with media literacy. So, you know, different age groups have different strengths, I would say. And then we also know that mis and disinformation is disproportionately targeted at diaspora communities, recent newcomers to Canada, folks who maybe are not as embedded in Canadian culture at this stage, and they end up being targeted often in lots of different languages, which then makes it even harder to track. And where influencers come in is influencers, as I mentioned, have this really great sense of how the platforms they work on actually function and how to get messages across. And so disinformation campaigns or groups or individuals who want to spread disinformation can plug into influencers' networks and get them to do the hard work of getting the information out and disseminating it widely. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting and troubling about it is even if only one person in the network gets paid or convinced in some other way to share the content, once it's out there, people collaborate, people do reaction videos, people comment, and then that information starts hopping through the network, through influencer to influencer to influencer, and to all their audiences. And it's harder to even know like where the disinfo started in the first place.
Yeah, wow. And it's different, but in a way the same as when you would get a newspaper and think, who's the editor, who owns this paper, sort of like who posted this, where did this come from? Especially with some of the examples that you mentioned, like why would someone want to be just openly sowing anti-immigration sentiments and making that like normalized? There's a lot to talk about there for sure. I guess you talked about it already, but I'm wondering if you can really break down for me, what is the appeal for a political party if they're like, I want to get influencers involved in this campaign? What's the appeal there?
Influencers, I mentioned already that they are really great at knowing the platforms they work on. A YouTuber knows exactly what words to use in their title, what thumbnails to pick for the main image that people are going to see when the video isn't playing yet. They know exactly when the algorithm has demonetized them. They know exactly when phrasing that they had been using suddenly goes out of vogue and the algorithm is no longer prioritizing it. So these folks know their platforms really well. They also have access to usually a fairly wide audience, sometimes that political parties can't reach otherwise or have a really hard time connecting with. And beyond just access to numbers of eyeballs, the influencers tend to develop these parasocial relationships with their audiences. So they develop this sense of connection. And you might know this too. If you have influencers that you follow regularly, you kind of get a glimpse into their daily lives. Maybe you see something in their experiences that is similar to your experiences. And through this, you develop this kind of sense of like, yeah, I'm connected to them. I know them. I trust them. And so this trust relationship builds. And that's super valuable when you're trying to think about getting a message out about how important it is to vote, who to vote for, what issues you should care about, those kinds of things.
Right. And that's different from a traditional journalist, whether it's, broadcast or print. You're seeking them out for a specific analysis, whereas your influencer, it might be easier to disguise what analysis they're picking to deliver to you. It's that trust, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think what you're bringing up there is really important. We expect different things from traditional journalists than we expect from influencers. So we might expect that journalists are going to provide us the facts in a balanced manner, and we might go to them for particular coverage of the election, right? But an influencer, there isn't necessarily the expectation of facts or balanced perspectives. Often we go to them for their opinions, for the kind of contextualized view on whatever the facts are. And often we go to them looking for things that are not related to an election, but then election content or other political content kind of seeps through here and there. And so you're not kind of going in with that critical lens on because you didn't go in thinking you were about to engage with journalistic material.
Right. Okay. So I'm glad you brought that up. My next question is that this report of yours, it highlights how influencers are stepping into the roles of journalists, traditional lobbyists, and even data brokers. Can you walk us through how this kind of, I want to say, a growing reliance on influencers for these roles, how it might be reshaping or even displacing the established roles of journalists, lobbyists, and data brokers?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the journalists. It's really interesting to see online how these accounts are creating this journalistic persona sometimes. And it's not all influencers who do this. Not all influencers are acting like journalists, but it's one of the roles that's getting played. And in particular, in the context of elections, there are times that these influencers who are saying, I've got all of the information you need to be able to decide who to vote for on election day, or I'm the one following the campaign trail, follow me for all those important updates. These people are then given access that journalists aren't necessarily given. So in the Democratic National Convention in the US, there were 200 influencers that were given often better access to people in positions of power to do interviews and collabs and whatnot than traditional journalists were given. We've seen in the Canadian election already that Jagmeet Singh's campaign bus has a special seat for the content creator who's following them for the day. That Pierre Poilievre's campaign with the Conservatives is giving access to content creators and influencers to do all kinds of content creation during rallies and is answering questions and meeting with them before and after different political events. So there's definitely this access that influencers are being given that journalists aren't, which means that influencers sometimes have access to information and can do reporting on things that journalists just aren't able to do because of that privileged access. Then when we think about the kind of lobbyist role or the data broker role, I would say it's less likely that they are going to replace traditional lobbyists and traditional data brokers, and more that they are being kind of added on and they're a part of a wider set of actors. So these influencers have a vested interest in making sure that laws and regulations related to influencers are done in a way that it doesn't disrupt their business, for example. And so them showing up on the ground to do lobbying with politicians is just added to all of the other professional lobbyists that are there.
And I know we talked about the example of Jagmeet Singh and that bus tour. There's so many different examples, and it's not limited to like one specific party relying on the influencers. It's kind of like a wide net going on. Do you have any other key examples that came up during your research that you found particularly interesting or that stood out to you?
So something that's been standing out to me is the number of different influencers who are now actually being interviewed for mainstream media, right? So there's a few different influencers who have showed up on a few different panels on the evening news for CBC and CTV. We've seen influencers being quoted in news coverage kind of across the board. And so influencers are being integrated into this media system in some interesting ways. I would also say that there has been some interesting evolution in who is trying to be an influencer when it comes to politics and the election. We've seen in our data collection this election a bunch of new accounts showing up on TikTok, for example, all trying to engage in this space. Some more successful than others, and it remains to be seen, who actually emerges as being able to amass a following that would kind of allow them to have the kind of influence that political parties really covet. But it's interesting to see that this is a strategy that folks are trying to take to be engaged in the political process.
And I'm also interested in hearing about the ethics of political influencing, because like you mentioned, there's that trust, that parasocial relationship, but also the idea that some influencers might even be paid but not disclosing it. So is there something that you can touch on there for the ethics of this kind of political influencing?
Yeah, absolutely. The transparency component here, I think, is just huge. So we know that for a democratic system to function well, for us to trust our elections, there are limits to how much money can be spent on advertisements. There are limits to when micro-targeting can be done and whether or not people deserve to have information about if they have been micro-targeted. We know that election laws have been put in place to try and maintain transparency around that spending and that targeting. But influencers can be used to evade those spending limits and evade those transparency regulations, which makes it really risky, I would say. We don't know all of the ways that influencers are being used in the election because it's really hard to find them. It's really hard to track them. And it doesn't always make sense for each and every action of each and every influencer to be tracked by law enforcement or a regulatory body because there's so many of them. And the amount of money we're talking about from influencer to influencer is sometimes very, very small. So it's really hard to keep track of what's going on. But people deserve to know when messages have been paid for. People deserve to know when somebody has been coordinating with a political party or civil society group or what Elections Canada calls third-party actors. People deserve to know when that coordinated effort is happening because that helps us evaluate the information and make informed choices on voting day.
And on that, do you have any thoughts or notes on what responsible influencer activism or advocacy might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this really great report that came out of a lab in Brazil. Unfortunately, it's only available in Portuguese, but we've translated it in our report. Some of the key highlights there are things like if you're going to be doing informational coverage, right? You're going to be providing facts. You've got to do some fact checking as an influencer. You got to make sure you are able to stand behind what you are putting out there because you are now an information deliverer. You are responsible for that information. There's also notes there about being as transparent as possible. If you have been paid or lines have been shared with you to say this or that, or you've been invited to some event for free and they've covered your hotel costs or whatever it is, be as transparent and clear as possible. There's a few other suggestions in there, but I'll let the listeners go read the report if they're curious.
Definitely. I can't believe it's taken me so long to bring this up, because this was also interesting, like, to me right away. You point out some concerns related to AI-generated influence as well. Can we talk about that a little bit? Like, are we already seeing synthetic influencers in politics?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. The biggest example that I've seen so far was actually in the last German election. In Germany, there was a political party that very transparently, to their credit, created some Instagram accounts using an AI-generated image and AI-generated content. And it was like, hey, follow me. I'm your source for information about this election. You should trust me. And here's all the reasons you should support this particular party. We haven't seen super popular accounts like that in Canada yet. There hasn't been a major AI influencer who's just kind of blown up and everybody knows about them, the kind of way that some of these huge, what we call mega influencers are. But we've absolutely seen a bunch of different accounts that maybe have an AI generated image as the profile picture, unclear who exactly is behind it then. We've seen accounts that have tons of AI generated content. Their whole goal is just generate AI content and feed it out into the system. Again, unclear who exactly has created that in the first place. And so that creates some of these transparency concerns that I was talking about. And it also starts to just kind of muddy the waters in terms of what information we trust and what we don't.
I'm running to the end of my questions here, so I've only got a few left. But given that we're talking about the impact of influencers on the way people vote, if we can wrap it up and ask a pretty broad question, what is the impact of how influencers impact the way people vote?
It's a great question, and I wish I had like a really clear, simple answer. But the reality is, because of all the gray zones between different kinds of influencers and what their roles are in the election, and because a lot of influencer work is potentially being done under the radar, intentionally, without transparency, to try and do things like disinfo or evade spending limits and transparency laws, or foreign interference we didn't even talk about, but it's in that space too. So because so little of it is transparent, it's really hard to track and measure. That said, we absolutely know that influencers are showing up on most people's screens as they're scrolling social media. We absolutely know that they are shifting our media environment and the way campaigns are covered. And so while I don't think that we are ever going to be able to say, 50% of this person's voting choice was determined by that influencer, we do know that they are reshaping our information environment, and we know that the information environment has meaningful impacts on people's voting choices.
With that in mind, and with the April 28th election coming up, are there any warning signs or anything that Canadians should look out for while they're scrolling through their feeds?
I think the big thing is just to keep that critical lens on, right? Even when you're watching your favorite influencer who's maybe not a politically branded account, if they start talking about election-related things, kind of let that be a little bit of a flag to be like, oh, I wonder why. I wonder what's driving this. I wonder where it came from. I wonder if they have any existing relationships with other entities, and just question the information that's coming across your screen. It's going to come across your screen. There is going to be that kind of content. And so just being aware that influencers might be playing a bunch of different roles, and they may be paid, but we don't have good disclosure requirements for it, that can help you just be a little bit more prepared to deal with it when it comes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Dubois about her new report on the impact of influencers and social media on election campaigns.
This episode is part of the AltElxn 2025, a national collaboration bringing diverse voices and critical conversations to the airwaves ahead of Canada's federal election. Don't forget to tune in to our live National Election Night broadcast on Monday, April 28th, and visit altelxn.ca for interviews, resources, and local station listings. A big thanks to our sponsors at the Covering Canada Election 2025 Fund, made possible through the Public Policy Forum, the Rideau Hall Foundation, and the Michener Awards Foundation. Thank you for listening. We'll see you on election night.